On October 24th, 1901, 63-year-old Annie Edson Taylor climbs into a custom-built barrel and is set adrift on the Niagara River. Moments later, she becomes the first known person in history to survive a plunge over Niagara Falls, a daring act born not of thrill-seeking, but of necessity. But how did she do it? And more importantly, why? Well, at the turn of the 20th century, Niagara Falls was more than a natural wonder. It was a magnet for daredevils. Performers, stuntmen, and dreamers came from around the world, hoping to make a name for themselves at the edge of its thunderous cliffs. But Annie Taylor wasn't like them. She wasn't young, athletic, or chasing fame for its own sake. She was a retired schoolteacher from Michigan who had been widowed years earlier, and she was struggling to make ends meet. Teaching had provided a steady life, but as she grew older, her savings dwindled. Annie hoped that one grand feat, something the world had never seen, might bring her both attention and financial security. Her idea was as bold as it was dangerous. She would go over Horseshoe Falls, the largest of Niagara's three, in a barrel of her own design. She spent months preparing. Annie hired local craftsmen to build the barrel. It was made of a sturdy oak and iron shell, 4.5 feet tall and just over 2 feet wide. Inside, she added padding to soften the impact. Before risking her own life, she tested the barrel by sending it over the falls with a cat inside. The cat survived, bruised but alive, and Annie took that as a sign. On her 63rd birthday, Annie Edson Taylor made her way to the edge of the river, then climbed into the barrel, wearing her best dress and clutching her lucky heart-shaped pillow. With the help of 2 assistants, she strapped herself into a leather harness, and the lid was sealed shut. To ensure she had enough oxygen to breathe and to improve the barrel's buoyancy, they used a bicycle pump to fill it with air through a small opening, then sealed it with a cork and towed it into the middle of the Niagara River with a small boat. Annie had hired publicists and promoters to ensure there would be a large crowd. Spectators gathered on both the US and Canadian shorelines, waiting anxiously. At 4:05 p.m., the current caught the barrel and pulled it toward the edge. Moments later, it disappeared into the mist and thunder of the falls. The descent took just seconds. Rescuers spotted the barrel bobbing below, trapped in a swirling current. After nearly 20 minutes, they managed to reach it and pry it open. To everyone's amazement, Annie was alive. Stunningly, she suffered only minor injuries, a cut on her head and a few bruises, but she had made history. She later said, quote, "If it was with my dying breath, I would caution anyone against attempting the feat. I would sooner walk up to the mouth of a cannon, knowing it was going to blow me to pieces, than make another trip over the fall." End quote. She hoped the stunt would bring her fame and fortune, and for a short time, it did. She toured the country giving lectures, posing for photographs, and displaying the very barrel that had carried her over the falls. But her manager ran off with the barrel and much of her earnings. Interest in her story faded, and Annie spent her later years giving souvenir photos to tourists at Niagara Falls for spare change. In the years that followed, others tried to repeat her feat, some successfully, but many were injured or killed in the attempt. Annie's name, however, remains first in the record books. Here are other events that happened today in history. In 1648, the Peace of Westphalia ends the 30 Years' War and shifts Europe's balance of power. In 1861, Western Union completes the first U.S. transcontinental telegraph line. In 1931, New York Governor Franklin Roosevelt dedicates the George Washington Bridge. In 1945, the United Nations is formally established when its charter is ratified by enough nations. In 1963, the Beatles begin their first foreign tour with a 19-minute performance in Stockholm. In 1992, the Toronto Blue Jays defeat the Atlanta Braves to win Canada's first World Series. In 2019, an exhibit opens at the Louvre celebrating Da Vinci 500 years after his death. And now it's time for our Today in History quiz. The U.S. warship Merrimack was rebuilt with iron siding and renamed what by the Confederacy? The CSS Georgia? The CSS Mississippi? The CSS South Carolina? Or the CSS Virginia? Liked learning about Niagara Falls? Then you'll love this one about the Grand Canyon. Tap the screen to keep the story going on Today in History.